On a quiet February afternoon in 1932, Patricia Maguire lay down for a nap in her Oak Park home, and then she just stayed asleep. Her eyes would flutter open, she could sometimes smile, and on rare days, she followed commands written on a chalkboard. But for 5 years, Patricia remained trapped in a liminal state, conscious but unreachable, breathing but unmoving. Newspapers called her the Sleeping Beauty of Illinois. Her mother kept vigil beside her bed. Nurses combed her dark hair. Doctors were baffled, but then the whispers started. By the way, this is Dark Case, and you can call me Jack. I bring you rare and unseen true crime cases, as well as other things that you may later regret knowing, with multiple uploads every single week. So if this sounds like your kind of thing, then join the Dark Case family now by hitting subscribe and turning all notifications on. And now for today's silly little question. If you had the chance to enter into a simulation that was completely convincing, once you're inside, you wouldn't know that it's fake. To you, it would feel completely real. In this simulation, you'd live your ideal life. You'd be the person that you'd always wanted to be. You'd have everything you'd ever wanted, and you'd feel truly, truly happy. But none of it would be real. It would all be artificial, just a simulation. However, you wouldn't know this. Would you choose to enter the simulation, or would you still rather stay in the real world with all its flaws? Let me know down in the comments. All of your support over on Patreon and via channel memberships here on YouTube are so appreciated. So thank you so much. And now, on with the video. By Christmas of 1934, Patricia Maguire had been asleep for nearly 3 years. But that December, something changed. Her brown eyes, once dull and glassy, finally began to focus once again. She followed her mother's movements around the room. When asked a question, she could sometimes curl a finger in response. To celebrate this, the family redecorated the living room. They brought out the ornaments that hadn't seen daylight since 1931, and in front of the Christmas tree they placed a new chair. It was specially padded and reinforced to support Patricia's now frail frame. It took 2 people to lift her from the bed. Her body, so long unused, had begun to forget how to sit upright. But thanks to her mother's daily massages and tireless care, her muscles hadn't yet fully atrophied. Patricia sat by the fire that Christmas morning, not speaking, not smiling, but the family believed she was now present once more. Photographers came, reporters hovered, and the name Sleeping Beauty stuck. Neighbours speculated about curses or divine punishment. Others whispered about gas leaks or secret government experiments. But one thing was undeniable. Patricia was far from alone in her experience. Across the country and in medical journals worldwide, doctors had started recognizing her symptoms: the eerie sleep, the cranial nerve paralysis, the twitches, the deep shifting mental fog. They'd seen it all before. It's just that most had stopped talking about it, that most had hoped it was over. But Patricia Maguire was living proof that the strange sickness had never really gone away, just that it itself had perhaps been sleeping. However, Patricia's story was not the beginning or the end here. Long before her, there was another wave. Between 1915 and the late 1920s, a terrifying illness swept the globe. It started like the flu, a sore throat, a headache, a strange heavy sleep. But for thousands, that sleep never ended. Bodies froze mid-motion, eyes drifted upward in an unblinking crisis. Some patients screamed involuntarily. However, this symptom was so rare that it earned its own name, clazomania. And when that screaming stopped, there would then be silence. Patients were trapped inside their own bodies. They couldn't speak, they couldn't move, but they were still aware. Doctors called it encephalitis lethargica, or inflammation of the brain with drowsiness. By 1924, it had infected over 1 million people worldwide, and roughly 500,000 of those died. Of those who survived, many developed a kind of frozen state. Years later, it would be called post-encephalitic Parkinsonism. muscles rigid, faces mask-like, minds still intact. For a brief time the disease was everywhere. To know of it was to live in fear. And then just as mysteriously, it vanished. Newspapers moved on. Families buried those that they'd lost. Survivors were institutionalized and mainly forgotten. And the medical community on large stopped asking questions. No one could explain what had happened. And perhaps more terrifyingly, no one could say that it wouldn't happen again. In the winter of 1915, war-torn Europe was bracing for hunger, as well as another wave of influenza. But in the hospitals of Vienna, something strange was happening. Patients arrived dazed and trembling. They were speaking nonsense. Some slept for days, barely waking to eat. Others were hyperactive, manic and hallucinating. A few froze in place, statue still, their eyes wide open but seemingly unseeing. Dr. Konstantin von Economo, a neurologist at the University of Vienna, saw something disturbingly familiar in these cases. But at the time, it was nothing that fit just one diagnosis. So he was the one that named this syndrome Encephalitis lethargica. Within months, though, the illness was spreading. Paris, London, Berlin, and by 1918 it was leaping continents. New York, Montreal, Mexico City, Delhi. People would go to bed with a sore throat, and well, they never came back. But what made this even more chilling was its unpredictability. In one house, a teenager might collapse in a stupor, whilst their siblings remained perfectly fine. One patient may recover in days, and another could deteriorate for years. Von Economo broke the syndrome into types: somnolent, hyperkinetic, and amyostatic akinetic. Catchy. However, these were all just different faces of the same sleeping demon. The doctor also noticed something else, something terrifying. Even those who recovered often were changed. They grew impulsive, aggressive. Some developed what he called moral insanity. Others lost the ability to feel emotion at all. And the youngest victims, those under 5, often ceased to continue developing normally, even when they were healthy and hitting all milestones previously. So this wasn't just a sleeping sickness, it was something that seems to rewire the brain. By the early 1920s, encephalitis lethargica had become a true pandemic. Tens of thousands of people were now dying, though not all at once. Unlike the influenza that surged and vanished in waves, this disease crept like a fog. It spread slowly and silently. It didn't seem to care about age or health. Young soldiers could collapse in barracks. Children would just fall asleep in classrooms. Mothers could lose the ability to recognize their babies. In some cities, it was common to see people sitting for hours on park benches, unmoving, expressionless, but they were otherwise fully awake. But some sat like this for decades. Medical wards became overflowed. And whereas the death toll was obviously horrifying, equally so was what it left behind. The world now contained thousands of people who were technically alive, but they were locked inside broken bodies. They couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't cry out. They were both there, but not. One woman spent 2 years in a hospital bed, her eyes open the whole time. One day when a nurse asked if she could hear them, the woman blinked once, meaning yes. But whether this should be taken as a positive or a negative, it's hard to say. Hospitals stopped naming the illness in charts. They called it catatonia, affective disorder, psychiatric collapse. But neurologists knew what they were seeing. They knew its name. They just didn't know what it wanted or how to make it stop. In the decades after the pandemic faded, survivors remained tucked away in hospitals and long-term care homes. Many were completely immobile. But in the 1960s, a young neurologist named Oliver Sacks walked into a ward in the Bronx and saw something extraordinary. The patients there, dozens of them, were still frozen in place. Some had been like that since the 1920s. Sacks believed that he could help them. He began administering a new drug, L-Dopa. This was developed for Parkinson's disease. Within just days, Some of the patients began to stir, and then, impossibly, they woke. They spoke, they laughed. One man reportedly stood up and danced, as though decades of silent anguish had melted away overnight. However, this miracle would not be long-lasting. In time, the patients' bodies began to resist the medication. Their movements became erratic, their minds more frayed. Some developed terrifying compulsions or sank into emotional torment. Others returned to their eternal stillness. It was a brief awakening, followed by a second, perhaps even more devastating silence. Sachs later wrote about the experience in his book, Awakenings, calling these patients extinct volcanoes that had erupted back to life, only to be buried once more. The public was stunned by his book, because by this time the world had forgotten Encephalitis Lethargica, but now it was remembered once more. But just as quickly, the world would look away once again. 100 years have now passed since this disease first stalked hospital corridors and bedroom doorways, and somehow we still don't really know what caused it. At first, doctors blamed the 1918 flu pandemic, but the evidence there never quite lined up. The symptoms were too different. The timelines didn't really match. Others suspected a bacteria or a virus that we've never discovered. In recent years, researchers have found hints, autoimmune markers, damaged hypothalamic neurons, even enterovirus traces in preserved brain tissue. But there's no single definitive answer. Some experts now believe that Encephalitis lethargica wasn't one disease at all, but a cluster of similar syndromes. Or maybe it was a one-time mutation, an evolutionary misfire that disappeared before we could understand it. That uncertainty leaves an open door, because if we don't know what caused it, then we don't know if it's truly gone. Patricia Maguire's case came years after the main epidemic, and she was one of the last. But every so often, a doctor somewhere will see a patient with strange sleepiness, with frozen muscles, a dazed expression, and they'll wonder, is it coming back? Has it ever truly left? How would the world deal with it this time around? And well, we may be forced to find out. In the spring of 2019, a healthy 9-year-old girl in Washington state fell asleep on the school bus. Her mother couldn't wake her. Doctors ran every test they could think of. Her scans were clear. There was no infection, no trauma, but she stayed asleep. For months on end, she drifted in and out of consciousness. At times, she could follow a flashlight with her eyes. Other times, she didn't respond at all. Some doctors would call this autoimmune encephalitis. Others whispered a different possibility. They pulled old medical books off the shelves, and they found themselves looking at the face of Patricia Maguire. Other recent cases, small, scattered, have been reported in Europe, South America, and Asia, each with subtle echoes of that old forgotten sickness, unexplained fatigue, muscle rigidity, masked faces. In a world still reeling from COVID, the question of viral triggers is no longer hypothetical, and researchers are once again paying attention. Some labs are investigating whether the immune system might be attacking the brain after certain infections. Others are studying the basal ganglia, the deep brain structures tied to movement, sleep, and emotion. But the truth is, we don't know if we're looking for a disease or just chasing a ghost of a mystery. Patricia Maguire passed in 1937, having never fully returned to herself. She became a symbol of what it means to be almost awake, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying illnesses aren't the ones that kill us, but the ones that leave us waiting, watching, and wondering if sleep is ever truly safe. Be careful out there, and I'll see you soon.